Hello, and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Tom Evans, a private equity M&A partner in Latham and Watkins' London office. In this episode, we delve into why music deals continue to be attractive prospects for PE buyers and how firms can invest in the music space while taking care not to hit any wrong notes. To do that, there is perhaps no better source than fellow partner from the London office, Libby Saville. Libby has a wealth of experience from the media and entertainment sectors and brings tremendous insight on today's topic. Libby, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom. I'm very glad to be here.
So before we dive in more deeply, let's start with broad strokes on the article that you co-authored in PE Views entitled, Why Music Deals Sound Attractive to PE. Music deals, particularly the acquisition of rights to songs and recordings by popular music artists, continue to be a major topic for PE teams. How did we get here? And why are these deals attractive investments for PE, Libby?
Yes, Tom. So to answer that question, let's take the first piece first and set the scene. So going back to the late 1990s, the music industry as a whole underwent a fairly steep decline for many years. And that was because of a number of factors, such as easy-to-use pirate sites, you might remember that, increasing internet speeds and the decline of CD sales, amongst other factors. But starting in 2014, that trend started to reverse. And that was driven largely by new streaming services that offered access to an enormous amount of music at a price that was attractive to many customers and in a manner that was easy to use. In fact, today, 62% of total recorded music revenue comes from streaming. So you can see what an increase there's been.
Wow. Yeah.
And the increased appetite to consume music in this way has helped to reduce the threat of online piracy. It's made it easier to track and predict revenues, and it's also ensured that strong revenues continue to flow to rights holders. So streaming has really changed the face of music. We've seen reports of 18.5% growth in paid streaming revenues in the last couple of years. Your second question was, why is this attractive to PE? And first of all, I guess there are reasons to believe that that growth will continue. So the number of global paid streaming accounts is still relatively small compared to the total number of global cell phone users. At the same time, music revenues are increasingly drawn from a growing number of sources, including social media platforms, video games, even exercise platforms, video streaming and virtual reality. So there's an increasing amount of markets for music. They're not only a wide variety of markets, but also emerging markets, global markets are also showing robust growth as copyright protection across various countries improves and streaming becomes more widespread. So as a result, another statistic, global music revenues are expected to grow quite significantly, almost doubling from $77 billion in 2019 to an expected $142 billion in 2030. So as the use of popular music continues to broaden, rights holders should also reap the dividends, and that's what makes these deals attractive.
So it sounds like this will continue to be a hot topic for some time then, Libby. Your PE Views article highlights the need for potential investors and acquirers to be alert to the often highly complex nature of investments in the music space, you said. Is it fair to say that different deal types require a mastery of different transaction issues?
Yes, I mean, for a start, music rights and how they're exploited can seem a bit arcane on the outside, particularly because there are two copyrights in music. One is in the compositions themselves, and then there is a copyright in the sound recordings as well. So target assets are likely to include a mixture of those copyrights, both in compositions and sound recordings, or they could also just include acquiring the right to defined revenue streams from the exploitation of publishing rights or of sound recordings. So you could have a real mixture. The older and larger the catalogue of assets, the more complex it becomes to evaluate those rights that are being acquired and to understand any applicable restrictions. Also, this is a people business, and there are numerous other parties who may have pre-existing contractual arrangements that will remain in place. For example, artists themselves, as well as third-party administrators who may administer rights to compositions on behalf of those artists, record labels who frequently own the copyrights to an artist's sound recordings and exploit them on their behalf, and performing rights organizations who monitor performances and collect and pay over royalties. So understanding these arrangements is an important part of evaluating and implementing each deal. And Tom, there's another consideration is that sellers of music catalogs range from sophisticated publishing companies to the artists I mentioned, individual songwriters, producers, bands, or even the estates of artists, and sometimes multiple parties who may not see eye to eye. So all of that has to be navigated.
Wow, it is really an eclectic mix of different parties involved in transferring or needing to be involved in transferring these rights. I guess, Libby, all of those different parties and their different perspectives and considerations adds more complexity to deal structures and diligence exercises, presumably.
Yes, they do. Tom, acquirers should bear in mind that they may need time to determine not just what they're buying, but whether and for how long they can continue to exploit the assets in the manner they were exploited prior to purchase, because not everything is in perpetuity. So you need to work your way through that to figure that out.
Interesting, Libby. And so, for those people like me who are new to this space, what else should listeners be alert to?
You need to look at, for example, re-recording risks, which is a factor in these types of investments. I mentioned before that sound recordings have their own copyright. So just to take that example, I assume our listeners may be familiar with Taylor Swift's recent re-recordings, which she's been putting.
Indeed, even I'm aware of that, Libby. Yep.
Exactly. And, her express purpose in re-recording her older albums was to create new versions of her songs. She owns the copyright in those songs. And she deliberately did that to compete with and draw listeners away from previous recordings owned by a successor to her original record label. So somebody else got the sound recordings, she owns the songs. So not every artist has the time, inclination, or market power that she has. But the release of those albums showed us that although this is still fairly rare, the risk is more than theoretical. So if a buyer is acquiring copyrights or revenue streams to sound recordings, it's really important to verify whether there are any recording restrictions in the underlying recording contract and the extent of such restrictions, because those restrictions could prevent the original recording artists from doing what Taylor Swift did and re-releasing recordings that could compete with and possibly reduce the value of the assets that are being acquired in the catalogue deal.
Interesting. So, switching gears then, Libby, let's talk about the growing regulatory interest in the area. Here in the UK, we saw the publication in July last year of the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports report into the economics of music streaming. That prompted the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA as it's known, to launch in January this year a market study into the sector. What are the considerations from those investigations?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to mention that because that's actually something that has progressed. We mentioned in the PE Views article that the DCMS report, but the study hadn't been launched then. So looking at that, competition considerations do loom on the horizon. The music industry has long been criticised by artists who believe that too little of the revenues generated are ultimately paid to them. But since, as we discussed, the industry is currently rebounding, regulators have taken a renewed interest in this area. The CMA itself said its study aims to establish whether the sector is operating in the interests of consumers and whether competition is working well. And as such, it will examine the market position of the major music groups and their contractual arrangements and streaming services and how these elements may impact the negative value attributed to different musical copyrights and artists' payment models.
Wow, it sounds like a watch this space on the CMA study. And is that and so it'll provide a top to bottom analysis of the value chain in the sector. So it could actually be quite handy, Libby.
I think that's right. I think it'd be very handy for PE firms, Tom. And the CMA will publish its conclusions in early 2023. So we should keep an eye out for that.
This has been a fascinating discussion, Libby, but let me ask you one final question. When PE teams are considering music investments, do they need to account for the management of music rights and how that differs from the management of other assets?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Tom. Thanks for asking that. Music rights are effectively living, breathing assets that require active management. Options may need to be exercised, royalties may need to be paid to artists, advances may need to be worked out, and artists maintain certain rights with or approvals over acquired assets. And they, of course, can be sensitive about the works they've created. So when considering this kind of deal, PE teams need to ensure industry experience within management teams who understand these issues and can liaise with all the relevant parties, including potentially songwriters and musicians. And of course, the PE team should seek guidance from expert legal counsel.
Like you, Libby.
Indeed. I'm pleased to say we have in the US as well as in the UK a team that can cover these issues. So what's evident, Tom, is that despite these complex issues, buyout firms like the Sound of Music deals, and we expect these types of deals to remain popular. In fact, we've seen fund investments, strategic deals between industry players and PE funds, as well as IPOs and securitizations of these assets. So there really is a lot happening in this space.
I love that reference to the Sound of Music, Libby. Thanks very much for including that, and it's been brilliant talking to you. I'd like to thank our guest, Libby Saville, a partner in our entertainment, sports, and media practice, for talking to us today about PE's interest in music deals.
Likewise, thanks very much for having me, Tom.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us from the links located in the show description. We hope that you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.